Good morning. Welcome to Eagle Mom Squad podcast. My name is Julie, and I'm here with Edie, my co-founder with the Eagle Mom Squad, and we have a special guest today, Gracie West, and she is going to talk to us about public school, what's going on with it. And the reason why we're talking about this today is because part of our mission with the Eagle Mom Squad was to help new families get ready to make that jump to homeschooling. And now that we're about, 8 weeks into the school year, maybe some of the new families that felt forced to homeschool their kids due to the pandemic situation are now wondering, gosh, can I keep going on with this? Or do I put my kids back into public school now that things, are getting slightly better in some aspects? So I met Gracie through a homeschool pod. She'd never homeschooled before. She is from Oregon. And Gracie has a really interesting experience, and she said some things to me at the pod about public schools, particularly in Oregon, that made me wonder what the heck's going on in our public school system. So with that said, I don't know, Grace, if you want to introduce yourself at all?
Sure. Hi.
Hi.
Glad to be here. So this topic is really, I'm passionate about it. It's close to my heart. Not so much the public school versus homeschooling, however, that's definitely intertwined, but what is going on in the public schools in terms of the philosophy that's being taught, the changes that are being made in the policies is reflecting the philosophy that is being taught. Now, I'm coming to understand that this philosophy is actually anti-liberal, and true classic liberals wouldn't even appreciate it. Mm-hmm. And so it's deeply concerning to me as a former liberal, and now as a conservative even. And it's concerning to my classical liberal friends as well. It's important to talk about, I think, because these changes that are being made are actually really covert and sneaky and clever. Mm. And partly why they're going unseen is because they're clouded in rhetoric that makes it sells it in a way that's false. Right. So the idea of equity is being sold, but actually what is being purchased is the opposite. Mm-hmm. And so that's significant and concerning to most people.
Right.
And I guess I could say that how this is being done is the difference between equity and equality.
Okay.
Which is why the word equality is changing and being erased in public schools and in public forums and in all kinds of legal documents. That word is being changed to the word equity. Now, why would
really?
you? Yes. Why would you need to do that
Right.
if you valued equality?
Right.
Well, it's because they don't. They actually don't want equality. And that's the difference between equity and equality. So, in the public school systems right now, let me give you an example of my children's public school in Portland, Oregon. Their school system, the district sent an email 2 days before they were going to have a meeting, and they said, hey, show up to this meeting, we've changed the code of conduct. And my husband and I, we have master's degrees in sociology. We have been fully indoctrinated into this way of thinking, this new philosophy, which is actually really dangerous. Mm-hmm. And so we've come to recognize that it's dangerous, and we can identify it when we see it. And so when we asked for the school district to send us the new document before the meeting,
right,
where we all get to put our stamp of approval, apparently.
Okay.
Even though they're going to go forward with it anyway. We asked, can we see the original code of conduct and the one that you created? And the reason why we did this is because they mentioned we have changed it because we had an equity, inclusion, diversity. Actually, they've dropped the word diversity.
Okay.
That's interesting. So they've had an equity and inclusion officer come through the school district and train them on all of the things that's wrong with their philosophy.
Excuse me, Grace.
Yeah.
Who is the officer working with? The Department of Education?
These are professionals that are paid outrageous sums of money.
Okay.
That go into corporations, school districts, companies, you name it. It's a new class of elites.
Right, so consultants kind of.
Consultants.
And who is this officer
they-
being paid by? I just wonder.
Well, that's a good question, actually. I think they could be independent contractors, but the school boards are accepting this new philosophy that is being created of equity,
Right.
and so they seek it out to be trained on exactly how they're bad, and they want to fix it, right?
Okay.
And so these equity officers who are paid like $200,000 a year, I mean, ridiculous. And they're in universities. That's why universities are so expensive, because these officers are getting paid like twice as much as professors. But they're really they're the morality police.
Right.
And so they come through and they tell the school district, you're doing it all wrong. Here's how you should do it. Equity. And they changed the policy. So we asked for a copy of the previous code of conduct, which is like how we expect children to behave, and then parent signs it. And the new one, absolutely different documents, 100%, didn't even look alike, none of the language, it was 100%. I mean, we ran it through a PDF thing where it shows you what's different, and it was like all of it, you know.
Oh my.
And so we read through it in detail, both of them, and I thought what was the most telling is they took out language in the first one of each student will be afforded their legal civil rights, not be discriminated based on race, class, sex, etc., right? They took that out, and they replaced it with language that we will allocate resources differently based on disaggregated data.
Right.
And what that means, being a master's level educated person, I know what that means is disaggregated data is class, race, sex, all the things we decide are important. We're going to look at that data in the school zone, and we're going to see, interesting, this race has been suspended more often. Interesting, this sex, gets all the things more often. The obvious conclusion is racism. They don't ask the question, what's the reason? It's implied. It's assumed that it's racism. If there's a difference between one race being expelled more often, it couldn't be social issues, couldn't be home life, couldn't be in poverty neighborhood, it couldn't be any of that. It has to be racism. So the obvious solution is we have to fix the outcome. So the difference between equity and equality is equity is about outcome. Equality is about opportunity. So we want to give equal opportunity to everybody to succeed, right?
Sure.
Now, if they don't, it doesn't necessarily immediately imply that it was the fault of an ist, sexist, racist, whatever, right? But that's equality of opportunity. You want to give everybody the kind of chance that they need, right?
Right.
Most people in the modern Western world would uphold that value.
Sure.
Doesn't matter if you're conservative or liberal. At this point, most people would say that's a good thing we want to uphold. It's actually part of a Western creation. Western civilization created this idea, right? And it stems from Christianity, but it has gotten in through the laws, right? All
Right.
men are created equal.
Right.
Obviously, history tells us that it hasn't always been applied, but we know the ideal and we strive for it, and we
Sure.
have progressed.
Right.
Well, equity, it has a whole history, it has a whole philosophy, it's a movement that has infiltrated academia, and it's being moved through the system of academia from the top, from university all the way down to preschool, and it's going into corporations and media and news and entertainment, and it's a philosophy that is very clever, because what it does is it masks itself in this idea that's being sold, which is equality. But really what it's aiming at is the equity of outcome, which means we want to see 50-50 for men and women. If there's 14% African American in this neighborhood, we want to see 14% hired here, even if 14% didn't apply. They're going to force the outcome to look exactly as it should.
Based on outward appearance
Exactly.
of the person.
Arbitrary physical features matter.
Which is racism and sexism.
Exactly.
Right.
So they don't believe in not discriminating based on race, because that's exactly what they would like to do, is hire based on race, hire based on gender. Of course, if there's too many women in a field, they're not going to mention it and try to fire some and get some men on board, like in teaching, for example.
Oh, that's not.
No, they won't do
Right.
that because they don't
Right. In
really
nursing.
care.
Oh, right.
Yeah, so that it's because they don't actually really care about the equity of outcome. This philosophy goes deep, and it's a philosophy of resentment, and it's our turn now.
Right.
So then how does this apply to the public school? Like you say, it's infiltrated the public schools. How does that physically affect our children?
Okay, so here's an example. We went to that school board meeting, and we had a letter that we written saying we will not be signing this document. And if there is any repercussion on our children in the public school system, you will have a lawsuit. This is
Right.
illegal. You cannot discriminate based on these things. Of course, they phrase it differently. Allocate resources based on historical oppression. What was the word they used? Historical something. So they're saying basically, based on historical categories of people, if you have been oppressed in the past, you will be privileged now.
Right.
And they say it in this sort of legalese or academic jargon, which doesn't, to the average person, it doesn't sound like that. But when I brought this to the school board and I said, okay, let's do a little thought experiment with your policy. Your policy says that you will allocate resources based on disaggregated data, okay? Discriminate based on all of these categories. Let's say too many of this race have been suspended. Because you say you're going to take into consideration in the moment that you're allocating discipline or resources or whatever it is, you're going to take into account your disaggregated data. What has been happening across the school board right now? Do we want to suspend this color of person,
Right.
this particular person? Well, this particular person is Hispanic, and too many Hispanics have been suspended based on how many should have been, if all things are equal.
Right.
So we can't suspend him for an egregious act. But we can suspend the other child who's involved in this fight because he's white, and we actually need the numbers up. So I said, this is a thought experiment we need to go through, right? I said, so this is what your policy does. Oh, but and this principal goes, but we don't really do that. I said, but your policy is saying that you need to. But, when practical things really come into play, we don't. And my husband said, but based on this policy, you're mandated to do that.
Right.
And she just kind of said, and I go, do you understand that that's actually discriminating based on these things? And she goes, yeah.
No problem.
Uh-huh.
But she probably personally has a big problem with that. But when you're in an institution, you have to be forced to do those things.
Yes.
So therefore, homeschooling.
Well, and I don't know that some of these teachers or principals or administrators truly understand what they're messing with.
Sure.
I don't know how many of them have been educated in the philosophies that I learned of in sociology, for example, or history of how Marxism, frankly, has sort of infiltrated the educational system, essentially, is the bottom line. But this philosophy stems from Marxism. Karl Marx believed in the haves and the have-nots, right? There's two categories of humans, those that have and those that don't. And his goal was to take what the haves have and distribute it to the have-nots, right? So his was this economic plan, and it's always failed everywhere it's been tried, of course. But what happened in the mid-century, 20th century, is this Frankfurt school got together in Germany. They wanted to reimagine this philosophy because it looked really bad at that point. There were some dark things that happened under that kind of stuff, and they had to make it look better, sound better, feel better, right? They get together, they say, we need to critique society. They took it a little bit outside of the economic haves and have-nots, the bourgeoisie, the proletariats, the people who have, It was less about a class war, but it kind of still is, because what they did is they decided to, it's called critical theory back then in the 50s.
Okay.
They discussed a critique of society. We need to critique society still, even though Marxist philosophy has failed us a bit. We still need to reimagine it. Maybe we got it wrong a little bit. We do need to critique categories. What are they going to be? Well, this has developed into, we're going to critique society based on different categories: race, class, sex, sexuality, and whatever else comes up in the meantime, right? I mean, there's a never-ending amount of things it could be.
To separate us.
Right, to separate and divide.
Right.
So there's those that have, and there's those that do not have. And there's the so this has turned into the oppressed and the oppressors.
Mm-hmm.
And based on your arbitrary physical features, how you were born, basically, you get placed in those categories. And you have privilege because of those categories. It doesn't matter if you actually do have money or power. It doesn't matter, because power is assigned based on your group, tribalism, right?
Right.
So they would say you are privileged. Even a poor white male in the streets, they would say, which I think is so evil and actually sounds pretty racist, like white supremacist to me. They would say a poor white male living in the streets has more power than Oprah Winfrey. They literally would say that.
What?
Yes,
does that
that's
work?
what I mean. Like, what? That's why we're having this
Yeah.
discussion, because it's
Yes.
so many things you've told me of like, what?
Because why? Here's why. They change the definitions of things. You have to change the definition of these things to make it work. It's like mental gymnastics. This is an academic's, playground.
Right. On those streets, not only is the homeless white man a victim, but the African American Oprah Winfrey is a victim.
Yes.
Because she
So they
has
strip,
been oppressed.
Right. So they strip agency.
Which gives you
they
no
strip power. They
Right.
strip all these things from someone. Ironically, from what they call a person of color.
Right.
Right. Which really just means anybody except whites. That's what person of color means. Anybody except whites. And which is weird, because right at the time when we started to say the phrase colored person is actually not a good phrase, is about the same time they came up with person of color, which it's, that should tell you something. It's like, whose side are you on exactly? And this is because it's very important to uphold these categories of race, and not as they were progressing, we were seeing race as less and less significant in the Western world, right?
Sure.
As society progressed, we started to see race as less significant to the ability of somebody to gain power. At that very same time, these Marxists, we call them social Marxists, they need these categories to stay stable, at least for race, because that is the access to power they need, is to keep that stable and important, right? And it is all about power. It's about power.
Because you have the people not of color feeling guilt
Yes.
that they had inherited, and you have the people of color being under the thumb because they have been oppressed and they're victims and they don't have
Yeah.
agency.
And you
so
have
you're
to keep-
controlling everybody.
And you have to keep them thinking that they don't have agency.
Right.
And I think it's really interesting that the majority of people that are pushing this ideology are white.
Yes.
And I think that should show you something.
It's disgusting.
Because
It is disgusting.
you really do need them to continue to feel powerless.
Because the whole point of homeschooling our children, at least in our family, has been to go back to raising someone with agency to do good in the world.
Right.
And no
And-
matter what your background is, you can achieve.
Right.
That was the dream.
That was the dream.
Now, one of the things you had also said to me, Gracie, was that when you were in Oregon and the pandemic hit, your school system sent everybody home, but they had arranged with a local business to get laptops and internet for everybody in the district that needed it. And that because some of the parents did not take advantage of those free services, the students, then the kids were not able to get an education. Therefore, the school system then said, well, then nobody's getting an education.
Right.
Because of that equity of outcome.
So they closed.
So they would not proceed with teaching the children
even online.
for months,
Goodness.
because the children, not all children's parents cared enough to take advantage of free resource. So their equity of opportunity was in place. We want to have every child the opportunity to get a laptop and to have online services.
Right. Right.
So they gave every child that opportunity, but because not every parent cared and got those services and supplies, or not every parent filled in the survey that said they did or didn't, then the outcome was unequal. It was unequitable, they would say. the outcome was unequitable. So they wouldn't go forward in teaching the privileged. They had their hands were tied because they've signed up for this philosophy. And so when you go into these meetings with these administrators, they're tying their own hands with their policies,
Right.
by saying we're going to change it from equality of opportunity to the equity of outcome. They can't get their job done. They can't teach the children who are ready and waiting to learn, which is the major majority of children,
Right.
are being held back in hopes that all children have a scenario in which the parent would care enough to help them.
Or maybe even the parent is busy, or maybe they're going and homeschooling without informing the,
Yeah.
I mean, for whatever reason.
We don't know.
Just glitches.
You can't know
Right.
all of it. Yeah.
Right. Yeah, you can't know all of it, and yet everybody paid. All
Everybody.
the kids paid for it. I
Everybody.
mean, they paid for it in lack of education.
Lack of education.
Right,
And
months
so,
and months
but
of
this is
nothing.
what happens with this philosophy is they want it's kind of like communism. It's like everybody will be equally impoverished because it doesn't work to make everybody equally rich. But the only equality you can have is equally impoverished. Period.
Didn't Chairman Mao promise that everyone would have a low level of
Yeah.
subsistence?
Yes. Because you
Except
know,
him, right?
Exactly, that's how it works out.
Yes, exactly. Well, see, they act like they don't believe in hierarchies, but the truth is they worship a hierarchy of oppression. So
Interesting.
there is a hierarchy of oppression. This is what they call intersectionality. So you are they've cut you up into various categories, right? Your race, your gender, your sexuality, your religion, your whatever. You know, they could go on, and they will.
I see.
It will get more elaborate because there's a thousand ways you could chop somebody into pieces.
Right.
And so what they do is they say, we're going to have to come up with a hierarchy of which one is most oppressed. Like, which one is it that's the worst when you oppress somebody because of it? And so currently it would be race is at the very top of the hierarchy of oppression. And so if you are being oppressed by your race, that's the worst possible. The next maybe trans, and this is a whole other story of why you don't want gender to be a stable category, but you do want race to be a stable category. Anyway, so there's this hierarchy, right? And then at the bottom, there's straight white men that are Christians, right? So there's but this hierarchy, it's not just about oppression, it's about authority of voice, your voice, how authoritative your voice is allowed to be.
Right.
And
We're seeing that.
your moral authority.
Right.
And so whoever is at the top of that hierarchy, let's say a disabled, trans, lesbian, black female or whatever.
Right.
I guess female would be FTM or MTF, male to female, which is ironic because then you have a biological man at the top. But anyway, basically they have the strongest moral authority because they are the most oppressed. So if they speak, that whatever they say is the truest.
Right.
But they do believe in hierarchy.
Right.
They just act like they don't.
Well, voice is so important.
Yeah.
We're seeing it with the social media
Yeah.
blocking
Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
facts that have been proven.
Yeah,
And
right.
Yeah.
It's
Right.
an emergency in knowing how we get at the facts as citizens,
Right.
as parents who are trying to show our children what is actually the facts
Yeah.
in the news.
Yeah.
And it's very clouded. I want to know your story a little bit more.
Sure.
Did you decide to come east as a refugee?
Yes. I just left Portland a few months ago. It was
After
on fire.
this-
It was before the real fires. It was a social fire
Oh
of
my. Okay.
people attacking police officers every single night for months.
Right.
And the city rejecting the help the feds tried to give and saying no, we have it under control, and the mayor who was saying everything's fine, and the activists were saying we hate you, he's one of the patriarchy, he's and they were attacking him, but he wanted to be reelected.
I'm
or
on your
cool.
side.
Yeah, and it's like he didn't know what he was he had no clue that he isn't going to be okay with them because of the nature of his arbitrary features.
Right.
So he didn't know what he was messing with.
Right.
So he tried to appease them, and this wasn't working.
Mm-hmm.
So they sent the feds back home, and this city is just in shambles. Cuss words sprayed over all the downtown buildings. I mean, it's a mess.
Mm-hmm.
And
you talk about what you just said about the cloud of, the voice given to certain people in media. Fascinating. I met you after I had spoken to a friend of mine who was, I don't know what media outlet she was looking at, but she said, oh, the mainstream media is reporting on what's going on in Portland, but that's not true. It's not that violent over there. It's not bad. And then she proceeded to tell me that this source of person was saying how peaceful everything was. And I said, well, then how do you know that that source is true? And then that shut her up. But then I met Gracie, and then she left there because of the violence and the chaos. So, you can't have it both ways. It's not peaceful and violent at the same time.
Well, I have to say, I have some local liberal friends, I should say progressive, and there is a difference.
Right.
Progressives are far left. I have some progressive Portland friends who are also saying those things. They live in the city, but they don't live downtown, of course, because they're privileged elites, and feel very guilty about that.
Right.
But they, as they should. I'm kidding. As their philosophy tells them they should.
Right, okay.
They also watch those same news sources, and they don't go downtown at night, and they are allowed to tell themselves and the rest of the world that this is fine, everything's fine, what are you talking about? They don't acknowledge the news when people are beaten to a pulp in the street, trans female beaten in the street, because she was perceived as not being far left. I don't know. It's just, they won't watch that content because usually that, like you said, there's a lot of censoring, and usually that content is on YouTube. I actually, thank God, YouTube was influential in me leaving this progressive mentality, because I got to see the radicalism and the extremism, and I said, I don't want to have anything to do with that. Right. That is not who I thought I signed up with. I thought I was liberal because I signed up with love, equality.
Sure.
But no, it's not at all this. And so I had to decide, I had to find out what is this then? And then I recognized, okay, this is progressivism. I don't want to be a progressive. It's dangerous mentally, physically. It's not going in a positive direction. I had to kind of back up and figure out, detangle my philosophy, where I came from, how I got there. I did live stream downtown on a Friday afternoon, and because I wasn't brave enough to go at night, it's just downright violent.
And I saw your video, and I was thinking you were brave to just do what you did, even if it was mid-afternoon. I mean, I'm like, I'd never do that. I'd never go there. So
yeah, it was a mess.
We do need to link that.
Police officers are being screamed at by a crowd of people across the street. They're yelling things like, I hope your wife dies of cancer. I hope your kids die.
The hate you see.
Oh, just
startling.
Vile.
Yeah.
Just vile. Go home and beat your wife. I mean, there's 3 police officers. One of them's a female.
Right.
And they're being screamed at by a crowd during the middle of a Friday afternoon. And I'm thinking, can my progressive friends seriously deny this? Like, they come down here?
Right.
So I guess to just to get back on the fact that we are a homeschool website.
Right.
You've now been homeschooling with a small group of people for about 2 months. Do you think that's something you'll continue based upon what you've learned about the different philosophies in the public school versus what life can look like for your family right now that's homeschooling? I mean,
it's a good question. So yeah, I am green into homeschooling, and I love what my children are learning. I'm looking through it going, okay, I'm learning how we got to where we are as Westerners. I'm figuring out, oh, this is the steps that we took to get here. And I've also learned about history and how this new philosophy is trying to destabilize Western civilization, and it's working. And I recognize the importance of my children to have a foundation of this classical education. And so in my heart, I want them to maintain this education. My kids, I think, would much rather do what they have always done, which is be in a crowd of kids. They're from a city.
Yeah.
You know, they've always been surrounded by kids. They got on a school bus and it was loud, and they went to school and there was 25 people in their class, and they had friends at recess and all this stuff. And so life overnight just flipped upside down.
Right.
And they're in a tiny town, and they don't hate it, but I think in their heads, in their imaginations, they think like, maybe someday I'll go into middle school and have that locker that I see on television.
Right,
you
right.
know?
Yeah.
And so part of me is thinking, okay, if I just say no and they never have this other life again, do they rebel? Do they reject it? So I have to ask myself those questions. But and here's another piece of the story is, before we moved here, I started to teach them what I knew. So when Trump was elected, for example, I was very upset. I told my children the sky is falling, right? And before he was elected, I told him Hillary would be elected, of course.
Sure.
And so history is going to be made tonight. And so when Trump didn't win, they go, oh, what's happening now?
Right.
And so I told them, oh no, basically Hitler's in office. So this was who I was back then. Well, I didn't say those exact words, but
Of
so
course.
I brought my children along with me and said, hey kids, guess what? I'm rethinking everything I ever knew.
Right.
That's great.
Follow me, Basically, before
Because
we got
it
here.
starts on the human level.
Yes.
To try to change this situation. I'm just going to imagine that that's how we
Yes.
can make progress.
Yes. So I taught my kids at the dinner table every night the things I started to learn.
Mm-hmm.
And I said, kids, I've always sort of been open to this concept or that idea, and I'm rethinking it, and here's why.
Mm-hmm.
And I would tell them things like, so there's this thing called trans. They were like 9 and 10 at the time.
Oh, right.
And I thought I needed to just prepare them because they're going to be encountering this any day
Right.
in Portland.
Right.
And so I talked to them about what it is. I wanted to frame it in my way.
Mm-hmm.
And so I said, there is this thing called gender dysphoria, and it's very rare.
Mm-hmm.
And there's also this thing called transtrenderism, and it's
Right.
very popular right now.
Right.
And the philosophy that lies beneath it is a desire to erase the stable categories of male and female. And so I've been teaching them what I know along the way. But interestingly, 1 month later, their little 8-year-old friend comes over, and they didn't recognize her because she'd cut all her hair off and was wearing boy clothes and was acting like a boy.
That was very good timing.
Good
that you
timing,
got to talk
yeah.
with them before that.
And she said, call me this boy name and these pronouns.
Right.
And she's 8.
Right.
And so they had a choice to make. What are we going to do? How are we going to interact with this person? Do we reject that and therefore reject her and kick her out of our life? I mean, we had to have these talks. So
It's pretty
here
hard.
we are
Yeah.
in this scenario now.
Yeah.
And how do I give them this foundation of Western civilization? Here's how we got where we are. Here's why it's valuable. And yet, what if I force them to stay in this context and they resent it?
Yeah.
So I don't know. I'm very conflicted.
Well, homeschoolers say 1 year at a time.
Right.
You know,
Yeah.
you don't have to predict all of their reactions and your reactions. You just decide each year what you want to do and where you are with things.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
I know a lot of people who homeschool during elementary and then public school during middle and high school.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
My
Yeah.
temptation is really to use our transition as an excuse to say we're just going to stick it through with middle school. In high school, you can go to public school, because I
Right.
feel like by that time I will have given them a foundation
Mhm.
that they could build on, or even just I am able to articulate for them the philosophies that they are going to come in contact with, and that those philosophies are directly competing with both Christianity and the West. And they're explicit about doing so. And how do you know they compete? Well, they use moral language.
Right.
Now, whenever you hear a professor tell you what ought to be and what should be, ask yourself, are they my rabbi? Are they my pastor? Are they my priest? And should they be? And do I want them to be?
Or
Do I
even are
want
they
a different
my
religion?
compass? Right.
You know? So I could give them that, I think, but my temptation is keep them in middle school and homeschool. We'll let them try high school. I have a feeling they might even give it a try and come back to homeschool.
Sure.
Very good.
Yeah. One thing is time use, because if you want to impart your wisdom and your training to your children, how much time do you have when they're public schooling?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it's
You
very
have
little.
A frantic morning,
Mm-hmm.
and you have
Dinner.
homework at night, getting dinner, and activities that they're going to be talking to you for a second in the car, and then they're off on the soccer field.
Mhm.
So you have bedtime, maybe?
Yeah, and it's important to know these curriculums that are in public schools are very much immersed in this philosophy of oppress versus oppressor, victim, perpetrator.
Right.
And everything they teach is in that. I mean, you will be shocked at some of the curriculum in math.
Mm-hmm.
It talks about math as a racist concept because it's created by white men, and logic and science and all this stuff that's actually evil.
Didn't it come out of the
Because it-
Middle East?
Yeah,
That's
but
still-
see, they lie about it. They say things like, the West is a white construct, but it's like, no, we come from Greek, Roman, Middle East. All of this comes from some other place,
Right.
but they lie to your face and they say, oh, it's all this white construct. They say time is a white construct.
We're in trouble.
They say reason is a white construct. They say
Really in trouble.
They say individualism, and they say being on time are white constructs. I mean, these are straight up white supremacists. How could they not be? Because if all of these things that have organized and made society better are actually from white people, I mean, how can you not call yourself a white supremacist, right?
Right.
I don't understand.
Just the other day, I was teaching the little kids in history. The numbers that we use are Arabic numbers
Right.
from Arabia.
But they are
It's
teaching.
not white. That's not Western.
But
you know.
they teach it as
Yeah.
if that's white.
Yeah.
It's straight up ignorant and
Yeah.
lies or just ignorance of history.
Yeah.
Well, it's been a fascinating conversation.
Yeah, thank
we
you
really
so much.
appreciate your insight, and I think we'll have more of these insights if we can
Yes,
work together a bit more
absolutely.
on blogs and videos and
Yeah.
more podcasts.
Yeah, that'd
Absolutely,
be great.
sure.
That'd be great. Thank you so much for
Yeah.
joining us, Gracie.
You're very welcome.
Appreciate it.
In the description, you'll find links to Gracie's information that she talked about and other things that she's doing, as well as our website, blog, videos,
Facebook page.
Facebook page, Twitter. So stay in touch, because we're going to make progress in building our children with their own agency and being able to find the facts, because we have the opportunity through our networks and through our internet sources that are being created outside the mainstream sources. So it can be a golden age of education, and we can make progress on what's really important.
And we encourage you new homeschooling families to keep fighting the good fight, because as you heard from Gracie, it's a jungle out there. But at least if you do it this year, you'll give your kids a bit of a foundation that you can continue to build on for future years, whether you decide to put them in public or private school, whatever your choice is.
And don't be afraid. We're
Right,
all in this
right,
together,
Right.
and we can work through it all. That's what Americans do.
Yep. We're resilient.
Right.
Yep.
Right.
All right. Thank you. Have a great afternoon.
Thank you. Thank you, Julie.